I think in a world that has relativized beauty, relativized goodness, and is rapidly relativizing truth itself, there is something about math that is kind of the last stronghold of objectivity, because even the most ardent relativist has a hard time not saying that 2 plus 2 is 4. Right?
Right.
Mean, if they're painted into a corner, you might get them to say it. Well, it might be true for you, but they don't really believe that, right? And so when we give math to our students, we're telling them there is objective truth in the universe, and by the way, that objective truth is eternal, right?
Welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockel. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I sit down with inspiring guests, and together we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jake Tawney, Chief Academic Officer at Great Hearts Academy and author of a new book on math, Another Sort of Mathematics, Selected Proofs Necessary to Acquire a True Education in Mathematics. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
We met just over a year ago at the ICLE conference in Kansas, and you gave a great talk on math. And when I saw it, I thought, this guy gets it. This is the kind of language, the kind of framing we need to sort of reclaim math as a central part of a full and Catholic education. And so I didn't know at the time you were working on a book, but when the book came out, I was just delighted because I knew it would be a resource that I and others that I work with would use. Why don't you start by telling us why you came to write this book?
Yeah, great question. And it's good to see you again, Brad. It was a great time at ICLE. I was very honored to be a part of that conference. And I've told many people since then that audience there at ICLE has to be one of the most electric audiences I've ever had a chance to speak in front of. So I'm glad you appreciated the talk. I certainly appreciated giving it. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, why does anybody write a book, right? So I can think of a few reasons. One, honestly, I wrote the book that I wanted to read. When you go through this publishing process, people often ask, who's the audience? Who's this for? And maybe I made just a terrible mistake in not thinking about that. What I thought about was, what is the book I want to read? And that book didn't exist. And so I decided to write it, right? So in some ways, that's one answer to the question. And what that means is it's a nice opportunity for me to get down on paper some of my thoughts about mathematics that I've had for several decades. But then I think, and maybe just more importantly, it was a chance for me to geek out in giving something of a greatest hits of mathematics, right? To go back through all the math education that I've had and start to pull out theorems and tidbits and these sorts of things that I think are amazing results and that people probably never saw and deserve to see, right? So that's one reason. I wanted to read the book. And so if it doesn't exist, then you go ahead and you write it. The second reason I would say, though, is maybe stems from a problem that I've seen. I have this theory that's been field tested on occasion, much to the chagrin of my children, where I ask a random person on the street, what does a mathematician do? And in doing this, almost nobody gets this right? And I tend to get three incorrect answers. So one is something about somebody sitting behind a desk for long hours of the day, finding creative ways to multiply large numbers together, right? And we kind of chuckle about that, but it turns out of the three, that one's probably closest to being correct. Because the other answers I get are something like an engineer. And then increasingly, the third answer is something like a statistician, right? Now, to be clear, those are great and noble subjects and great and noble careers, but not really mathematics, right? I mean, engineering is applied mathematics. And for statistics, while certainly in some ways a branch of mathematics, I think there's a reason why in large universities, the Department of Statistics is separate from the Department of Pure Mathematics, right? And so we should ask ourselves this question, right? Why is it that after 13 years of math education, K through 12, maybe more if you took some in college, why is it that people can't describe what a mathematician does? Now, of course, I'm taking for granted that a mathematician does mathematics, right? And so, ergo, if people can't describe what a mathematician does, it's probably because they don't know what mathematics is. And I think that's true. Now, this doesn't make me necessarily super sad. I don't think they've learned things in K-12 or, again, longer in college. I don't think they've learned things that are distant from mathematics. But I do think that in all those courses and all that time, they've never had the opportunity to actually engage in the act of mathematics, right? Whereas lots of people went through education, had a chance to write a short story, right? They had a chance to even analyze literature. Like if you think about what a literature professor does and you compare that to how you interacted with literature in your courses, there's not that much difference, right? Or even in science, again, not to this is probably oversimplifying. Certainly in high school, we don't have all the complicated vocabulary or concepts that a professional scientist has, but we do emphasize the scientific method. We do talk about what it means to do science. We don't really do that in math. So I think what people have had is a lot of facts. I think they've had a lot of algorithms that they've memorized. I think they've had a lot of applications. And so it seems to be something like advanced computation and application. Those are not bad things, but they're not at the core of what it means to do mathematics. And so in some ways, that's the motivation, right, behind the book, is a chance to really engage in the conversation about what mathematics is. Now, to be clear, there's sort of another motivation I have, which maybe is a little bit sneaky, right? There are several books that talk about the nature of mathematics, and they spend 200 pages doing it, and they're great and wonderful books. But what I have noticed is they don't actually end up doing much math, right? And if I want people to know and to love the art and the discipline of mathematics, and I want to write a book about that, it seems like we should spend some time talking about the nature of the subject and the nature of what it means to do math, but we should spend the bulk of our time actually doing and engaging in mathematics. And so that's what you see in the structure of the book. 90% of it is actually just doing math. Now, I think it's math that people have probably not seen before. If it's not heavy in algebra, there's a lot of geometric concepts in it, but it really holds proof as sort of having a pride of place as the center, maybe actually the end of mathematics. And so I think that's in some ways also maybe the motivation behind the book, is to produce something that I hope very humbly is unique among the books about math. That it doesn't just talk about math, but it actually then engages in doing math. And so in many ways, maybe to kind of wrap up this answer, I would beg the reader's patience as they make it through the first 3 chapters and everybody's energized. Like, I've never heard math described this way. This is great. And then they get into part 1 on proofs that we're going to go through. And there might be this moment of, oh, wait, I think I might have been bamboozled. It turns out this book is just math. And my answer is yes. If we're going to love the discipline, you got to do the discipline, right?
Right.
And I think that's part of the motivation of doing it too, is to fill what I saw was kind of a hole or a vacuum in some of the books that are doing similar things.
Right. Yeah, I looked at the table of contents and found it interesting because part 1 is something like a philosophy of math, right? Which is maybe what people are expecting the whole book is. But part 1 is the shortest. Mm-hmm. It has 4 chapters, mm-hmm. and one of them is already a warm-up for what's coming next. So it's really 3 chapters that are more, philosophy of math. Yeah. Just to give people a sense, I'll read the titles. Why is mathematics worth knowing? What is mathematics? The quest for a better mathematics curriculum. But then let me read the titles of the next 3 parts and then ask you, how you came to organize the book in this way. Because I think that's even interesting to think about. So part 2 is 10 proofs everyone ought to know. Part 3 is 10 theorems worth knowing, though the proofs are difficult. And part 4 is 10 unsolved problems worth knowing. So that's the vast majority of the book is those 30 chapters, 10, 10, 10. Talk to me about the decision to choose those three like categories of problem and organize the book in that way?
Yes, this is a great question. Let me actually start here, right? One of the motivations behind the organization of the content really comes from the book's title and the honor that it's giving to Father James Shaw, right? So give me a little grace on that explanation here. Father James Shaw wrote a book called Another Sort of Learning, and it was really at the time, pretty groundbreaking because he's continuing the great books movement, right? And it was a book on all the things that you should read that you were probably never made to read, right? That was the motivation of the structure of the book itself, and then therefore also the title of the book. Here's a list of things from mathematics that I think people should know, but you probably were never made to know them because they don't fit cleanly into techniques for solving equations, applications in the real world. Some of them you'll find in geometry. Geometry is sort of the last bastion of K-12 mathematics that keeps something of the very nature of the discipline. And so to answer your question about the organization, it starts with that. It starts with, what are the results? What are the results that I want people to know? And originally, I thought I would just have two parts. And it was going to be divided into sort of things we know and things we don't know. And I was going to take people through a list of theorems and proofs, which really is what you find in part one. Here are some beautiful theorems and beautiful proofs that I think people should be aware of. Some of the theorems are going to be familiar. The Pythagorean theorem, the fact that the angles in a triangle add up to a straight line or 180 degrees. Maybe people saw the proofs, maybe they've not seen the proofs, but then there's other results like the bridges of Königsberg that maybe no one has ever even heard of that theorem. And so that was the motivation behind what originally was just going to be part one. Here's the results I think you should know. That got split into two parts because as I started cataloging on my own things that I think are just really wonderful theorems, it became pretty clear that some of them are proofs that we don't either have the page space to go through, or in some ways those proofs are just really, really hard, right? Probably the most obvious of which is Fermat's last theorem. You take this as a theorem that is so easy to understand. If you have some experience with the Pythagorean theorem, you can understand the question Fermat's asking. But it turns out that proof is hundreds of pages long that requires some really complicated concepts in professional mathematics. And I'm probably exaggerating a little here, but I don't think I'm exaggerating much. There may be 10 people in the world that understand that proof, right? But the theorem is beautiful and we should know about it. And so that's how part two came about. As I cataloged the things that we know and that I think you should know, it got divided into proofs that we can digest and proofs that are hard. But what I like about that second part is even though we're not going through the full proof of these 10 theorems, in some cases we outline it, right? And we're just missing some details, like the case of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In other cases, we really do just state it, but I have little tidbits that also have proofs kind of along the way. So it would be a mistake to think that all the proofs in the book are only in the first, well, I guess the second part, right? Even the third part where we say these proofs are really hard, there are little proofs along the way, right? So proof still holds pride of place in this. The third part, again, was always going to be sort of the second of the two, right? The things we know and the things we don't know. I am a huge fan, if we're talking about trying to disclose the nature of really any discipline, but in particular of mathematics, of making sure people know about original sources and unsolved questions, right? Knowing both those things tells us a couple things about the nature of the discipline, right? The first thing tells us that mathematics is the product of real men and women struggling with concepts, asking questions, solving problems, and creating proofs. Sometimes in our math classes, because it's so textbook driven, we think of the discipline as, kind of something from on high, as if like all the math came down from Mount Sinai and is delivered to us. And if you just had enough time and interest, you could learn all the math there is, right? But these ideas were struggled with by real men and real women throughout history. And so even though we're quoting original sources in the book, we're not, of course, duplicating all those original sources verbatim, but we are going back to those original proofs of Euclid and Euler and others, right? And so having those original sources, or at least reference to the mathematicians and the work that they did, is an important point in trying to decide for ourselves kind of what this discipline is. But the use of unsolved problems does the same thing, right? Math is not a nice packaged discipline in which everything is known. Exploration and unknown things is not the sole possession of science, right? Math has lots of unsolved questions, and many of them most people can understand with some basic knowledge of the four operations, maybe fractions, right? People can understand these questions, even though the best mathematicians in the world have worked on it, and they don't know the answers to them. And what that does is it tells us that math, like all truth, is a mystery. And here we mean, mystery not meaning like a murder mystery or mystery novel is something to be solved and exhausted, but nor do we mean something that's just to be taken on faith. We mean something akin to the Dostoevsky's Onion, right? That the more, to use the old adage, the more you know you don't know. That as mathematicians start answering questions, it also opens up other questions. And so I've often felt that even in our pedagogy, even in teaching math, it's important to have unsolved problems. And so that's where those two parts came from. And then again, that first part kind of got extended and split into two based on how easy the proofs were.
When I work with teachers, we often say, what does this discipline tell me about God or God's creation or God's relationship with creation? And one of the things that comes up on occasion is like the way proofs work in math are somewhat analogous to how proofs work in something like natural theology, right? Before you get to revelation, your reason can start with axioms. And if your syllogisms are valid or whatever, you're going to get to a good conclusion. But the mystery layer is actually really interesting because the definition of mystery that you're using is in a certain sense a theological definition, right? God is a mystery. That doesn't mean we can know nothing about God. It means we can never know everything about God.
That's right.
Right? And it's interesting that you can have an image of that in creation that you can discover through math, which I think this is going to come up in one of the later questions because you have a great quote about math joining heaven and earth that I want to get into. But before I do, one thing I want to dive into, it strikes me as I was looking at the book, I thought one way to describe this is like this is a book of math appreciation, right? And it was interesting that you used a description or the analogy with what you would do in a literature class, right? In a literature class, you're doing more like what writers do than maybe what you're doing in a math class is like what mathematicians do. And in art, like something like art appreciation, where we say, not everyone's going to be a professional artist, but everyone's life will be enhanced by knowing and appreciating good and true and beautiful things through art. And I felt like that kind of logic was underlying your approach to math. Like of course, not everyone's going to be a mathematician, but everyone has something that can be enhanced in their life through appreciation of the beauty, goodness, and truth that is revealed to us through something like math. First of all, how does that analogy with art appreciation strike you? And then could you walk us through one of the proofs as an act of math appreciation, if in fact I'm on the right track at all in calling it that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like the analogy. I want to dig into that a little bit, right? So I think in some ways it depends on how we're using the term appreciation in the context of art appreciation, right? What I would never want to see, even in art education, is students' experience with art only becoming, only reduced to the viewing of great art, right? So oftentimes, I remember this from school, right? From when I went into school, only the talented art kids took art technique classes, right? And the kids who demonstrated some talent in music took music performance classes, right? And then kids who just didn't want any of that took art appreciation or music appreciation, in which they sat and it turned into some kind of art history, or music appreciation, you sit and listen to them. All these things are great, like, don't get me wrong, but if you really want to appreciate something, you have to encounter it for what it is. And so here's where I like the analogy between art and math. Both of them, even though one is properly a fine art and the other is a liberal art, right? So, and the difference between a fine art and a liberal art is that a fine art has a product that is external to the human mind, right? So a painter makes a painting, a poet writes a poem, right? It doesn't mean that there's not making or poesis in mathematics. It just means that the product of it, even though we physically write it down, the product of it is actually in the mind itself, right? But it doesn't mean that there's not a making. Mathematics is inherently creative, right? There's this. I'm very delighted with the conversation I'm trying to engage in the chapter on the fundamental theorem of algebra, in which we think about the creation of numbers and whether or not we're discovering those numbers or creating them. And I use Tolkien's concept of subcreation to talk about kind of what the mathematician does there. So therein, I do think that your analogy, Brett, works well. As long as we understand that in our appreciation of those subjects, it's important that we do, right? To appreciate art, a student should be taught art techniques. To appreciate music, they should be taught to sing or to play an instrument. And in fact, dare I say, even to write some music, right? To appreciate math, you have to learn to do math, right? And so there is a way in which the book is math appreciation, but what I don't want that to be understood as is, so it's math appreciation, and so therefore it's not really math, right? Actually, I want you to appreciate or to fall deeply in love with the discipline of math, but we can only do that if we're showing you what it is, if you have a real encounter with the thing itself, right? So I think in that way, if we understand it that way, then you're right. The book has some flavor to it of kind of math appreciation. So I like that.
So choose a theorem. Ideally, one that is easiest to do without a lot of visual aids, given the medium we're working on. Some people are going to be watching this as a video, but a lot of people are just going to hear the audio, right? So is there one that you would take us through to just give us a flavor of what you're doing in the book through the practice of an actual proof or theorem that we can appreciate here together? Yeah.
You're asking a question. The question is to describe a proof without using visuals. And this is particularly challenging. So I just want to comment on that for a moment, right?
For sure.
Because I actually do think that a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? To use the old adage. I think that in mathematics, pictures often disclose the truth of the theorem in a far more efficient way than a step-by-step proof does. We talk a lot in our schools that we run about in the K-5 world of starting with the concrete, like actual objects, moving to the pictorial, and finally to the abstract. And one point I make is that, as we move into middle school and high school, the necessity of the actual physical concrete kind of falls away. Like developmentally, you don't need that anymore. Pictures never do. We always need pictures to help us understand things. And that's as true in geometry as it is in algebra. There are great algebraic theorems where if we can try to latch our minds onto a picture, it becomes a lot more clear why something's going on. Whereas a purely algebraic approach to a proof, we sometimes feel like I get every step and I see where you started, I see where you're going, but I don't really understand why the thing's true. You feel lucky. You feel like I just went through the steps, I connected them logically, and I kind of made it to the end, like navigating through a corn maze and coming to the end magically, but you didn't look down on the maze to actually see how the path makes sense. So I know that was a belabored defense. Maybe in some ways I'm lowering expectations for your audience. I think it's a hard thing to do, but let me take a stab at it. Let's talk about prime numbers, right? So prime numbers are, I think the best way to define them is the basic building blocks of mathematics. Now, we'll often hear people say, a prime number is a number that's only divisible by one in itself. We got to be a little bit clear with that because one is not a prime, One's not prime and it's not composite. We can argue about that later if we want. But for mathematicians, 1 is not prime. And so as long as we ignore that, then the definition seems to be right. Like 3 is prime because it's only divisible by 3 and by 1. The problem with that definition is it's not very intuitive, right? I mean, you can understand it. It's intuitive in that way, but it doesn't give meaning to the essence of the thing itself. I think the better definition, even though it's maybe not quite as rigorous, is that prime numbers are the basic building blocks of multiplication. And here's why I say that. We know from our elementary math school experience that we can take any number like 24 and start to construct a factor tree. Right? 24 is 4 times 6, and then 4 is 2 times 2. And we hit 2, and you can't split it up anymore, right? You can do 2 and 1, but again, one is sort of this special number, and then you just end up with infinite splitting, and that's not really what we mean. We mean go down to the numbers that don't have proper factors anymore. And then we reassemble the number all the way up so that 24 becomes, right, 2 times 2 times 2 times 3. It's the product of primes. And we can build up any number that way. And that seems actually to be intuitive because we can tear down any number that way. So you tear it down, then you can build it back up. Here's why I think this is important. Because the question becomes, how many of these basic building blocks are there? And just to justify that this is an important question, if we do the same thing with addition, the answer is boring. If I split any number up into addition, I will always end up with all ones. That's it. The number 5 is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and that's it. There's only one basic building block of addition. Every number can be assembled as the sum of ones. So we know something about primes, if only because 2 and 3 are primes. But I want to focus on that for a minute, Brett. The fact that there are even 2 primes is already amazing. Because with addition, there's only one number. There's only one basic building block. With primes, with the basic building blocks of multiplication, we already have 2. And so all of a sudden, mathematicians are interested. How many of these things are there? And Euclid proved that there's not just not 1 or 2 or 3, but it turns out there's an infinite number of them. And that is absolutely remarkable because, again, you're talking to someone who thinks it's remarkable there's even more than 1, right? But why would it not just be, look, it's really only 2, 3, and 5. Like everything can be assembled from there, right? That's not unthinkable that this should be the case, but it turns out it's not. And I'll give the outline of the proof, but I would encourage your readers to look up Euclid's proof and to try to go through this in its details. But what Euclid says is, look, what would happen if there's only a finite number of them? Like, let's suppose we have them. So maybe there's, 10 of them, right? He says, look, multiply them all together and add 1 to the result. And it's a brilliant move because if you multiply them all together, like let's say one of your primes is 2. So you're going to say 2 times 3 times 5 times a bunch of primes, right? Well, that number is divisible by 2 because you have a factor of 2 literally in it. You constructed it to be divisible by 2. When you add 1 to it, no longer divisible by 2. And 2 is not a special number. All the 10 primes that went into that, this new number that Euclid came up with, this 10 primes plus 1, it can't be divisible by any of the primes that you have in your list, like by construction. He developed it that way, which means there must be another prime somewhere because all numbers are either prime themselves or can be broken into primes, right? And so what Euclid does in a very just beautiful and brilliant way is to take all the finite number of primes that you might think you have and to use that to find another one. And then the brilliant thing is you find another one, maybe you have those, but he says, no, add that to the list, multiply, add 1, you get another one. Multiply that into the list, add 1, you get another one, right? And just for the mathematicians watching, when you multiply them all together and add 1, you don't always get a prime number in that result. But if you don't, you'll still have a prime that divides into it. Because again, all numbers are either prime or they're divisible, or they can be broken into primes. Either way, you found one that didn't exist. And that's amazing, right?
Right.
That's quick. I think that's a decent attempt at a non-visual proof.
I think you chose well, because I think I tracked with you. But as you were talking, I thought, you know what? I've had the experience that Euclid had, something analogous with like a 4-year-old who says, "What's the largest number?" And
That's
it's
right, yeah.
8 billion, or it's a Googleplex, and then the other 4-year-old says, "But what about Googleplex plus 1?"
Yeah.
Or what about Googleplex plus Googleplex, or Googleplex times Googleplex? Yeah. And pretty soon the 4-year-old realizes that there's no end of integers.
That's right.
Right. And something very similar, a little more elegant, obviously a little more creative, but something quite similar is what Euclid is doing here, right? He's taking the max that you can think and then realizing that by adding 1, you can think more.
Now, you want me to blow your mind here, Brett?
Oh, please.
So there's a chapter in the book about how many irrational numbers there are. And the chapter is not really about how many irrational numbers there are. I mean, it is. This is where it ends. The chapter is really about sizes of infinity. And it starts off with the very dialogue you're imagining, right? 2 young kids saying, when I'm old, I'm going to be rich. I'm going to have $1 million. And the next kid says, oh yeah, I'm going to be richer than that. I'm going to have $2 million. And then the kid's 3 million. And then finally, one of the kids gets smart and says, I'm going to have an infinity amount of dollars. And then the other child says, I'm going to have infinity plus 1. And the first kid says, that doesn't win. That doesn't beat me, because infinity plus 1 is still infinity. And I asked the question in this chapter, is that true? Are all infinities the same size? And it turns out they're not. Some infinities are, and some infinities aren't. So the kid who says infinity plus 1 is the same as infinity turns out to be right. Those are the same size of infinity. In fact, 2 times infinity is also the same size. Right? But it turns out there are infinities bigger than that, right? So this will blow your mind. There is the same number of whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, as there are integers. And integers have the whole numbers and they have negative numbers. So wait, how can that be? How can there be the same number of integers as there are positive whole numbers, so positive integers, right? And it turns out those infinities are the same size. It turns out, though, that the number of irrational numbers is way bigger. It's a much bigger size of infinity. And this theorem to me, or this whole, it's more than a theorem, this whole theory of sizes of infinity, this is literally the topic that made me fall in love with math in college.
Is the infinite number of primes smaller than the infinite number of integers?
No, it's the same size.
That one's the same.
That's the same.
But the irrational is larger.
The irrationals are huge, which is wild if you think about it, because like, how many whole numbers do you know? Well, like lots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? I mean, the second grader can just keep going, right? How many irrational numbers do you know? Pi, e, square root of 2. Like maybe you can think of others. Maybe you can combine them, 2 pi, right? But like it turns out, I actually know that many of them. And yet there are way more than them. So much so, by the way, that if you have a number line and you randomly drop a point, just randomly drop a point in the entire number line, the probability that you hit an irrational number is 100%. Which is crazy to think. How can wait a minute. What if I hit 3? Like, that's not irrational. Like, I get it. I'm just telling you, when we talk about probability on infinite sets, that can be complicated. But I'm telling you, a randomly dropped point on a number line has 100% probability of hitting an irrational number. That's how many there are. But it's like if a circle sort of makes up all real numbers, the set of rational ones is not a small circle. It's like a tiny little dot in the middle of the bigger circle. It's just it's less than a drop of the bucket. It's less than a drop in the bucket.
Is it true to say, okay, and I don't want to like geek out so that we don't actually ever talk about some of the philosophical questions
Sure.
in part 1. But is it true to say that there is an infinite number of infinities?
There are an infinite number of infinities. That's right.
So that has come up with when my math teachers I'm working with are looking for images of God in math. That one often comes up, and so I just wanted to make sure that that's true.
Yeah.
So,
but can I pause for a minute here, Brett, and say, like, something you just said is very delightful, right? So your background is in is it theology?
Yeah. I'm a systematic theologian.
Yeah. So not a math background, but I love what you just said. Well, we probably should get to some of the philosophical questions, but so I don't mean to geek out on this math thing, but it's like, no, let's geek out on the math thing. Like, that's the whole point, is to fall in love with the math and not just the commentary about math, right?
Right.
I mean, like, that's a great moment. That's a great moment to say, let's pause on that and actually ask a math question.
So in my presentations for teachers, I have to do a lot of philosophy and theology, but at one point we put a pancake on the screen and we carve it up, and we do the lazy caterers problem, and it's one of the most fun parts of the thing because we're geeking out on math, and kind of part of the point I'm making for the teachers there is we all want to know the answer, even though it's not intuitive, and none of us have a test, and none of us is going to lose our job. Whether if we get this right or wrong, we just want to know what's true because it's true, because that's the kind of creature you are.
Yeah.
And I make them undergo the experience of like, just like, tell us the answer. Like, why doesn't this make sense?
But look, the tell us the answer can be frustrating to a math teacher when the kid's like, can you just tell us? But we should admit, like, that's born from something. That's born from this insatiable desire for the truth that kid has, right? And so, like, we should honor that. We should say, like, hey, I really appreciate that you want to know that answer. We should try to find this together. Like, let's have real knowledge. And not that I'm suggesting we make this philosophical distinction with a fifth grader, but this is where a distinction that Aristotle would make between true opinion and knowledge is important, right? True opinion is just knowing something that is true, but it happens to be true, but you don't know why. That's not knowledge. Knowledge, to know the Pythagorean theorem, is to know the proof, right?
Right.
To just be told the result is to have a true opinion, right? But we should honor that in our kids. I'm a big fan of honoring some of the things that annoy other teachers. When a kid in class does a problem in their head and doesn't show their work, I say, well done, my good and faithful mathematician. That's amazing. Now, can you please write it down for all posterity so that people can see your thinking for ages to come?
Right.
Well,
so this is a great leap off into my next question, which has to do with the sort of the leitmotif of the book, which is the first line of the book, not counting the introduction, but the first line of the book, which is repeated more than once throughout, where you say, there is something unique in the human soul that can only be satisfied by wondering about mathematics. And I remember being in the crowd at ICLE when you said that, and people laugh because it's kind of a joke, but it's also not a joke, right? But what it tells you, I think, is it tells you something about the human person. I mean, it's a claim about math in one sense, but it's a claim about the human person on another sense. So what kind of a thing is the human person that this is true about us? Because it's not true about zebras or rocks or orbits or all these other things we encounter.
Well, it might be true about zebras and rocks and orbits and things that we encounter, but maybe we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
I should actually give credit where credit's due, and I do reference this in the book every time it's said. This is a statement that came from my good friend Mike Austin. I heard him say this about 11 years ago, and he was just instrumental in reading early drafts of the book and helping out. And I remember being in the room and hearing him say this for the first time, and it was said, I think, in the context of why do we study math? And the bold claim here is we don't study it because it's useful. It is useful, and that's an amazing thing. And that will get to the point about how math bridges heaven and earth, right? It is useful. Mathematicians are often thousands of years ahead of their time in playing with numbers and shapes, developing theories, finding true things, and then hundreds, thousands of years later, a scientist, an economist, an engineer, somebody finds use for that. So I'm not opposed to application. Like, that's a wonderful and beautiful thing, but it's not why we study it, right? Math is a liberal arts, right? And in fact, math is really, stay with me here, 4/7 of the liberal arts, right? The classic liberal arts are the 3 arts of language, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the 4 arts of number, quantity, right? Whatever you might describe them as. And those are the quadrivium. And that always surprises people a little bit, because in the quadrivium, you have arithmetic and geometry, which everybody knows is math, but you also have astronomy. But see, for the ancients, astronomy was not the chemical makeup of stars, right? It was geometry and motion. We almost think here of Kepler's work, right? And then music is the fourth one, but the ancients understood music as arithmetic or quantity in relationship to itself, right? The discrete quantity in ratios. If you play a stringed instrument, you know this, right? That if you take a string and cut it in half in a 1-to-2 ratio, you get the musical interval of an octave. And so I think this is significant, actually, right? So even though I might believe that studying zebras satisfies something unique in the human soul, I think I might believe it more for math. And
I meant studying zebras, yes, but zebras they're not satisfied by math.
Oh, that's true.
That's what I meant. Yeah, the human person is satisfied in a way that all the other creatures we encounter,
that's true.
They're not interested in that, as far as we could tell. Yeah.
So, look, I actually do think that all the disciplines we teach satisfy something unique in the human soul, because, in fact, they point to things that are true, right? Things that are true, things that are good, things that are beautiful. All of them find their source and summit, I think, in the three transcendentals, right? But I would say, and with all due apologies to teachers of other disciplines here, right? I do think there's something fundamental in the universe about word and number, right? I mean, after all, the second person of the Trinity was revealed as word. And even in speaking that sentence, I'm speaking about number, right? Like we have three persons in one God, right? And so I do think there is something the ancients were onto in looking at the seven liberal arts in terms of language and in terms of number, numerical reality, shape, right? All of that. And so I think there is something very unique about math in that way. That's part of, maybe that's not a defense of why it satisfies something unique, but it might be trying to describe what the unique thing is, right? The unique thing that it discloses is something about the very fabric of God and the universe, right? That word and number seem to be the two basic things well, I mean, you're the theologian, right? But the two basic things that God uses to speak, right?
Right. I mean, so from the theological point of view, right, like our knowledge is mediated.
Yeah.
The angels are really interesting because angels have immediate knowledge.
Right.
So they wouldn't relate to reality through word and number the way we do.
Correct.
Right. This is a function of having mediated knowledge, and number in particular. I think one of the things that strikes me about number is when you see a mathematical truth, you can't unsee it.
Correct.
It presents itself with a kind of clarity that satisfies something in your soul. And when you know that it's true, there's a kind of rest for the spirit in knowing a true thing with a kind of certainty, and that truth is available through many media. But there's a certain way in which truth discloses itself in math that speaks differently, that highlights the kind of truth where we long for. You know, there are other kinds of truth, like, I don't know, let me think, like something beautiful in art is always like inducing more longing. Like there's some, like the real thing is just beyond our grasp, right? Yeah. And there is mystery in math, and we don't have the completeness of it, but you can have a small thing of it where you get a discrete sample size where you solved this Sudoku puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's done, and you know it, and it is what it is, and it will be that way for eternity, and you are participating in that thing right now. And I can't think of another discipline that discloses truth in that way to us while we're in this valley of tears.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a little bit of what Aristotle was after at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, when he says, he's talking about the certainty that we can have in the study of ethics. And he says, this is not the same level of certainty that you can have as you can in the study of mathematics, right? It doesn't mean that you can't know. It doesn't mean that you can't discover truth. But the level of certainty he's talking about ethics, but I'm reading in a little here. The level of certainty in mathematics is something special, right? There's something sort of very obvious. You're right. Like once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you learn the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, you're discovering something that was true before you were born will be true long after you are dead, right? And this again is another one of my arguments for the unique nature of mathematics. I think in a world that has relativized beauty, relativized goodness, and is rapidly relativizing truth itself, there is something about math that is kind of the last stronghold of objectivity, because even the most ardent relativist has a hard time not saying that 2 + 2 is 4. Right? Like, I mean, if they're painted into a corner, you might get them to say it. Well, it might be true for you, but they don't really believe that, right? And so when we give math to our students, we're telling them there is objective truth in the universe, and by the way, that objective truth is eternal, right? There are non-eternal objective truths. I have my reading glasses somewhere, but my reading glasses are a 1.25 strength. That is an objective truth. That will not be an eternal truth, because I can already feel my eyes getting worse with old age, right? So there are some truths that have some changing aspect to them. I mean, granted, these reading glasses now are 1.25. So even there's objectivity, but there's something about math where that truth just never changes, right? It's objective and it's eternal, and kids know that. And then the final step of this, and this is, I think, the critical one for our culture, is that the truths in math are truths of objects not made of matter.
Right.
You've never seen a perfect triangle. You've only seen approximations, or you've seen triangles that participate in the perfection of a perfect triangle. And yet, even though we've never seen it, we can say true things about it. Right? Now, in a world that wants to be materialistic, in a world that wants to deny the existence of God, show me another subject in which all kids learn there's objective, eternal truths in things not made of matter. That seems to be really, really important. So these objects really are the properties of the heavens.
Right. I suggest to my teachers that one assignment they can do with their kids is ask them to bring a 3 to class on Monday.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the kids are going to bring, 3 of something, but whatever they bring, even if it's a mark on a paper that their culture has agreed indicates 3-ness, it will be illustrative of the fact that you can't ever put a 3 in your pocket. And if your culture can make a mark that everyone indicates 3-ness, it's because all of you can conceptualize 3-ness and then agree on an arbitrary mark, right? But there's some abstraction that tiny people are capable of, right? That is totally not material, but that starts from the material. We abstract from the material order, but human beings live with like one foot in two worlds, right?
Here's what's crazy too. At least for low numbers, very young children can conceptualize the meaning of 3 before they can count. Like we actually know this, right? We know, and I forget what the cutoff is. I think it's something like 5 or 6. It's called subitizing, where they see a picture of 3 and they say that's 3. They know 1, they know 2, they know 3. I think they can do 4 and 5. After that, they have to start counting, and counting actually is a much more advanced skill. That involves being able to understand that these words that I'm speaking, this sequence of words, 1, 2, 3, lines up with a certain set of objects. That's actually a complicated thing for young kids. But it's so interesting to me that they know number before they can even count. They will look at 3 and say, there are 3 there, right? And it's just really wild to me.
Right. One of the things we talk about with the little people, science and math in particular, is you talk about the wonder and the beauty and the order of the universe. But I say, don't forget to have them notice that the fact that they can do these things, I didn't even know the word subitizing, but the fact that they can abstract from material reality into a spiritual reality like number means that they are a particular part of creation that is wonderful too, right? And so we're interested in the beauty and order of creation outside of ourselves, but also the human person has a role in creation that's unlike anything else we've encountered, which oddly enough makes us the only creatures we know that do math.
Agreed.
Right? And like, notice that. Have the grade 2 notice that they're the only creatures that do that.
Right. And we do have to be a little bit careful. We're not careful there. I just want to, again, remind ourselves that the process of doing math is the process of discovering truth and then writing a proof about it. Right. And so, within the context of shape and number and the content that's within the discipline. But you're right. We're the only ones that can do that.
Right. One of the things, I have a few more things I want to get to. I know we're getting close on time here. Let me combine the next two thoughts and see, because you've already hinted at the transcendentals. In chapter 1, you explore math in light of truth, goodness, and beauty. So tell us a little bit about each of those three transcendentals and its relationship to math. And then the next thing I was going to ask you, which I've already hinted at before, and I think you can probably do these in one, is you have this line in the book. It's one of these lines that shows up more than once, that math unites heaven and earth. And I think that's really an interesting parallel with some of the work I've done. Like I just said, like the human person is this spiritual and material creature that is straddling both these realities, and therefore is the only creature we know that does math. And I think that's maybe an interesting connection with this idea that you present in the book, that math is somehow a bridge between heaven and earth. So transcendentals, and then this idea of bridging heaven and earth, which I think go together.
Yeah, I'll just touch on the truth, goodness, beauty thing. I work in classical education, and one of the dangers I think in classical education is that there are certain tropes that can become just bumper stickers if we're not careful. And maybe number one among that list is truth, goodness, and beauty, right? We talk about this all the time. So we're always challenging our teachers, our students, our school leaders, wherever we can, not just to speak truth, goodness, and beauty, but to start to talk about why we believe this, right? Why we think that these subjects are born from and point towards truth, goodness, and beauty. I talked about truth quite a bit, right? I think actually one of these images I have of the disciplines is that truth, goodness, and beauty is like an old equalizer, right, on a stereo. And all the disciplines have truth, goodness, and beauty, but some of them emphasize one more than the other, or maybe they get at the others through one that's primary. I think the visual arts, all the arts actually go after beauty, and through that get to goodness and truth. I think literature is fundamentally about goodness, and through that is true and discloses beauty. There's something there about literature having beauty too in the construction of the sentences, right? I think math, this seems self-evident to me, mostly emphasizes truth, right? And I already kind of defended that and why I think that's important. Goodness comes from this idea. There's lots of ways to talk about this, but one of the ideas I think about is, again, that notion that we don't study math because it's useful. We study because it's sort of good in itself. It's something that satisfies something in our own soul. It's something worth pursuing for its own sake. So there's a good that's there, and the will is oriented towards knowledge of that good, right? And beauty, man, I mean, if a proof is hard to do without visuals, beauty is perhaps even harder to do without visuals, or at least sound or something. I think math is beautiful. I would love to have a longer conversation with people about, some of the categories within philosophy of how we think about beauty in terms of balance and definition, right? All of this. And how that plays out in a mathematical concept or a mathematical proof. So some of the ideas are beautiful, and all the ideas are, but sometimes we think of an idea as being, immensely beautiful. Some of the proofs are beautiful, right? Mathematician Paul Erdős understood there may be 100 proofs for the same theorem, but they're not all equal. Right? Some of them are better than others. And the thing that he would point to above all is what he would call elegance. But I think in some ways he's after the same thing. There are certain proofs that are just beautiful proofs, right? I'm glad you asked about heaven and earth. This is something I love talking about. And I really believe this to be something unique about math. So I think we already talked about how we can know things about objects that are not made of matter. And so the objects of mathematics really are the things of heaven, right? They're not in the material universe. The triangle, the notion of three, these exist beyond the material universe. And yet the material universe seems to speak of mathematics, right? There's no, and this is why within the discipline of math, you see application actually going both ways, right? It would be naive to think that. What did I say earlier? That mathematicians are always ahead of their time, right? That they develop this theory and then at some point there's an application. That's true. That's actually how most math works. That's not how all math works, though. A lot of our understanding of conics comes from questions about how the planets are moving, right? And so we actually did seek to learn something about the universe, and from that, mathematics came. And so this is what I mean when I say math bridges heaven and earth. It deals properly with immaterial things, and yet the material created universe seems to speak about this, right? Ratzinger, before he was elected as Holy Father, he said at one point that the way in which how do you do this? The laws of logic, the human mind, and the mathematics and the design of the universe, the fact that they seem in some ways to all be the same, they're all speaking the same realities, is proof of the existence of God. Like something needs to be held up there holding those things together. That if the way the mind worked was different than the laws of mathematics, we could never know anything about the created universe, right? And so the bringing together of these kinds of ideas and the fact that they form sort of cohesive looks at reality, Ratzinger saw as a proof of God's existence, that something had to be holding those things together in continuity.
Right. I've heard. I'm not very what's the word, versed in the literature, but I've heard that there are papers and discussions about like the fact that math works is kind of a mystery. And if you don't have God, it's really hard to account for a universe that discloses itself via math and that always works. Like it's this, like the internal coherence is not what you would guess, you know? And then you add the layers of, and that the human person is actually adequate to appreciate the truth of it.
Right.
Right. And to go back to what you said about mystery, not in its full depth, but the things we know, we actually know. And we can know that they're true, even if we don't know everything that's true. Yeah. Right. A last one. So this is kind of a practical question, but it got my attention when I read this. It's a couple paragraphs. You talked about how sometimes in math, we try to make like real world problems, which on the one hand are not actually real world problems. Like they rarely actually speak of math problems you'd actually have to deal with in real life, but also that are introduced on the premise that they would like make this relevant or interesting for students, as if like math in itself can't make its own case, right? So you're almost like obscuring the beauty of the thing by imagining it. I feel like there's like an analogy here with like liturgy that you think will appeal to young people, but then it doesn't. Yeah. because you're like, oh, the thing itself actually won't speak loudly enough for them to apprehend the thing. So we actually have to like clothe it in this costume to make it appealing. And then it ends up not working. I don't know. That analogy just popped into my head right now, but talk to me about the problem of real world math problems and what's a better approach.
Very good friend of mine, Dr. Eddie Mulholland from Benedictine in Atchison, Kansas, gave a delightful talk called the myth of relevance and the relevance of myth. Now he spent quite a bit of time talking about literature and myth and this thing, but he also made this very argument, right? That when we seem to go after the second thing, right, the relevance, we seem to actually miss a lot, right? This is C.S. Lewis's principle of first and second things. Keep first things first and second things second, and things tend to work out, right? If you give math or anything, right, its own due and say this is beautiful in and of itself, and you can learn to love and appreciate this, the relevance is just never even a question. But you're right. We in no other discipline do we hear the question as often as we do in math. When am I going to ever use this? And I think we've done a disservice to our students by actually trying to answer that. Do you know that the textbook industry has standards, and these change, of course, but there's standards of something like 60% of all problems now have to be real world problems. It's like, I mean, and this is because we're trying to make math relevant, but the point here is, how many of these students are going to go into mathematics? And the answer is almost none of them. And so then we try to do these word problems about baseball batting averages, and it's like, no one's doing that. They're just going to look up the averages. No one's sitting there with the data figuring out how to calculate a batting average, right? I have this great story I've told about hanging crown molding in my old house in Ohio. And I don't know if you've ever hung crown molding, but it's a compound cut, right? And so there's a lot of angles involved. And I remember doing a lot of trigonometry to figure out how to set this saw. And what I realized was, my walls aren't straight and none of this actually worked. And what I really needed was a carpenter to come over and show me how to make these cuts and use a coping saw to deal with this, right? It's like, that's the point, right? The math is not about its usefulness. And the more we try to do that, the more we give into the reality that they're not going to use it. And if they're not going to use it and we're trying to argue the usefulness of it, that's just a recipe for convincing them further that it's useless, right? It's not solving the problem, it's actually deepening the problem. Because the truth of the matter is, that's not why we teach math. We teach math because the objects are beautiful, because the human soul yearns to think mathematically and to know things about these objects. And until we get that right, we're gonna have a hard time getting kids to fall in love with math, except for the very few that might have math careers later.
Right. I talked to a teacher in New Orleans. She gave me my favorite answer to the question, students, why should I study math? They'll ask about anything. Why should I study history? Why should I? But she was a math teacher, and they said, why should I study math? And her answer was, because you can. And I thought, like, you can write a lot of philosophical paragraphs, but that gets most of it in like 3 words, right?
That's right?
Because you can. I think like that's a perfectly legit answer. It might not satisfy every student in the moment. You might have to, over the course of years in your institution, you want to inculcate the sense of what we're talking about here. But I think as like a tight encapsulation, I think that's a perfectly legit answer. Jake, before we go, tell folks where they can find you and your work.
Well, I'll tell you where you can find the book, right? So you can find the book on Amazon. You can also find it from the Encounter website. So it's been out since the summer. Reception's been very good on it. I'm just super humbled by the reception of it. So I would just encourage people to go to Amazon, go to Encounter Books website, pick up a copy of that book, and then send me a note. Send me a note and let's talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jake. And everyone, thanks for joining us this month in the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, go ahead and do that and share this. Let the algorithm know that this is something worthwhile, and let your friends know about the work that Jake is doing and all the work we're doing here at Making Every Class Catholic. Thanks again, and God bless. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters and presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.